I would resemble my educational history in figments of feelings of passion and ebbs and flows. Through adolescence, like many others, things within me were changing, and I was constantly interweaving between hobbies, new thoughts, ideas, and philosophies, navigating my own morality amidst it all. I never thought I'd become a teacher, or go to university to become one. I wanted to become a writer, and then a painter, and then both. I moved schools 5 times throughout my entire education, and I think this is because I struggled with routines. Unable to settle, I needed new stimuli wherever I went. I was bored easily, perhaps because I was forced to do subjects that really disinterested me. Subjects such as science and maths really affected my own self-efficacy, as I used to be someone who attributed my grades to my own self-worth. From a young age, I decided that if I wasn't going to be amazing at something, then I wouldn't try, and at previous schools, my teachers gave up on trying to teach me. Therefore, I think I really noticed the things that grabbed me: literature, the arts, philosophy, and to my own surprise, Greek mythology. It wasn't until I reached VC that I began spiraling into this realm of passion. It was as if everything that inspired me had this eternal link. I studied visual arts, which linked to classical studies and vases, which also linked to literature in the form of plays, where I had to study the philosophy of Socrates that echoed in much of ancient Greece. The aesthetics of poetry, the feelings that colour and line and shadow admit. I think the fact that I was so immersed in so many aspects of my education drew me to want to share it with others. Learning literature at my first high school sparked something in me that none of my other subjects had. And I think it's unfortunate that some students go through the system without finding that fundamental passion. I remember it so clearly. My teacher was so excited by Ted Hughes' Full Moon and Little Frida, and I'd never seen poetry painted so eloquently and clearly in my brain. I still had never really gotten into art at that stage. That was to come later, though I think that was when I was truly exposed to an aesthetic, an intangible feeling that lit up so much more in my little teenage brain. That's why I want to teach. I want to bring forth in my students this inner belief in self-efficacy through passion. Even if the subjects I teach aren't their favourite, there's still a mark I can leave to create a community of safety within at least one room in their life. Space to lead with authenticity, unapologetically. As Sir Ken Robinson explains in his TED Talk about changing education paradigms, I also believe that we need to be teaching through aesthetic experience. He explains that this as the senses operating at their peak, to be fully in the moment of things you're experiencing, and you are fully alive. I believe that my last school achieved this for me. Bendigo Senior College reconstructed the way I looked at learning. It stripped the 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. routine and allowed me a sense of freedom, and to be on the same level as my teachers. Small things such as being able to address my teachers by their first names completely changed the dynamic of learning for me as a secondary student. It granted me and the cohort with a ground of mutual respect and allowed for a lot more trust in teacher-student relationships. It humanized teachers as much as it did students. Hubner explains that teachers meet persons. Teachers encounter a uniquely formed person, different from any other person in the world. A person with his or her own particular story, which is both history and promise. I felt valued at that school more than anywhere else I had attended. Even though completing Year 12 in the middle of a pandemic, my teachers went above and beyond to check in on my year level. Whilst being in smaller classes made this easier, I believe that there needs to be a certain boundary between student and teacher relationships. Although I don't think it needs to be drawn with such a coldness that is used in the younger year levels. In my perspective, as a student, I matched and mimicked the energy I was given by a teacher. And if I felt like a burden, I would act like one. If I felt respected and of holding an expectation of greatness in my own learning journey from that teacher, I would try harder. I think sometimes all a student needs is for someone to believe in them. And while sensitivity might be held to a fault or a representation of weakness in the system, I think it's necessary to give students a safe space to try without the fear of disappointment. I think that the Victorian and Australian school system should include a breadth of Aboriginal education throughout the entirety of the curriculum. The Alice Springs Declaration of Education says that it ensures that education promotes and contributes to a socially cohesive society that values, respects, and appreciates different points of view and cultural, social, linguistic, and religious diversity. Therefore, there should be a push for Australia's rich and true history. Senior Australian of the Year winner, Dr. Miriam Rose Ugama Bauman, explains in an ABC interview that she walked both roads. Having to learn the Western version of education, alongside her own Australian Indigenous way of life, and now it's time for the curriculum to teach both. I myself, through all of primary school, was not taught about the true atrocities of Australia's beginnings. And it was not until high school that I began to learn about the mass genocide of Aboriginal peoples on their land. And that's not good enough. Change has been evolving, people have been becoming more and more educated about the needs for reconciliation for First Nations peoples. Though more needs to be done, and in education we have the power to tell the truth from the beginning of every student's learning journey. This is a necessity in paving the way for reconciliation and respect for country. As Biesta writes on the philosophical purpose of education, by acknowledging the fundamental weakness of education, by seeing it as something that is educationally desirable, as something that is proper to education rather than as something that threatens education, it is possible to expose and counter attempts that see this weakness as a problem that just needs to be solved. By exposing the weaknesses in education, in our society, we find the fundamental purposes of education. Another subject that I would include in the Australian curriculum would be gender studies, from an early age. The ostracisation of the LGBTQIA+ community has suppressed the quality of lives of so many human beings, and still is to this day. And again, education is power. By including gender education, such as learning pronouns, sex education, the danger of gender stigmas, etc., within the curriculum at a young age, we can create an openness towards gender diversity, creating a safe space for students, especially by the time they are in higher year levels, to be and embrace who they truly are in their community without judgment from their peers. Hubner explains that a mere concern for teaching moral and ethical values to young people is hypocritical, indeed immoral, if adults fail to address the significant moral and ethical issues of their workplace. Justifying that fundamentally us, as teachers, need to also be educated on these issues and learn from those who have suffered injustice to practice exactly what we teach to our students. I've said it many times throughout this screencast, though I'll say it again. The utmost power in society relies on education, and that is something that I am so excited for my generation to hold. Education matters, much like Plato's analogy of the cave within the Republic. Like Socrates, teachers have the choice to bring students to a light of truth, of morality. To cast light in the shadows of ignorance that may face their students in every other aspect in their life. I have this opportunity to do the best that I can to flow equality, morality, and awareness within my classes, in the time that my students are in my classroom. Therefore, if we all, as teachers, use this rich life experience to create a classroom of truth and evolving progressive ideas, society as a whole will hopefully follow in step. Thank you for listening.